Hi, folks. We're just getting set up here, waiting a couple more seconds, and we'll begin the webinar. Okay. Hello, everyone. Just a quick note before we begin. For those of you tuning in on Zoom, we have a live transcription, closed captioning option available during this program. If you're joining us on a desktop or laptop computer, you can simply enable it at any time by finding the CC live transcription button in the navigation menu. So formally, welcome to today's conversation, exploring the ins and outs of community engagement journalism. My name is Hannah Waltz, and I am the US Free Expression Programs Manager at PEN America. For those of you who don't know us, PEN is an organization that stands at the intersection of human rights and literature to defend the freedom of expression in the US and around the world. I'm super delighted to share this virtual stage with our speakers today, who we will introduce momentarily. But first, I just wanted to offer some more context around why we believe that an intentional and inclusive practice of community engagement journalism is an essential piece of the puzzle and pushing back against distrust and disinformation that has come to characterize the present age. We have been building community resilience against disinformation for a number of years now through media literacy workshops, town hall type discussions with journalists and community leaders and more, and view free and equitable access to accurate information as an integral condition of free expression. But false information, media manipulation, news deserts, antagonism toward the press, and the historic underserving of communities of color, rural communities, and other marginalized groups all work against open access to fact-based, culturally competent reporting and jeopardize opportunities for journalists to foster healthy, non-extractive relationships with the community members they set out to serve. Community engagement journalism helps newsrooms better understand and locate information voids, spaces that are especially vulnerable to disinformation, and fill them with credible reporting. It breaks down barriers between communities and those who report on them, which builds the trust necessary to freeze out disinfo. We are very grateful to present and celebrate this panel of expert practitioners of community engagement journalism today with our generous co-hosts at VoteBeat and our partners at the Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks finally to all of you in attendance, and we hope you will feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box. And now to say a few words about VoteBeat, I'll hand it over to Chad Lorenz, Editor-in-Chief.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. It's really good to be here. I want to explain a little bit about VoteBeat because we're a very new type of journalism outlet, a small news network focused on covering local election administration and voting access in 4 states currently. What's unusual about our focus is that we do not cover candidates or campaigns or even the results of elections. We cover the nuts and bolts of the election system, factual information about how elections work, and the state laws and local policies that affect voters and the ways that they can engage politically, the concerns about barriers to voting, especially for historically disenfranchised people. We've also been focused on covering the threats that aim to undermine elections and spread misinformation about vote fraud and spread distrust in elections. We were started by Chalkbee, a similar news network that's been around much longer and covers local public education, as a short-term experiment in 2020 when the rhetoric about vote fraud and misinformation was proliferating. We relaunched as a permanent news organization in May of last year with reporters in 4 states, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Texas, and Michigan. And that group of our founding staff included Lauren Aguirre, who is our moderator today. So I'm very proud to see her leading this fascinating and important discussion.
Thanks so much, Chad. And now onto our panel. We'll have about 30 to 40 minutes of moderated discussion and then open the floor for questions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand it over to our moderator today. As Chad said, Lauren Aguirre. Lauren is the engagement editor at VoteBeat and has spent her career in local news working to connect people to the information they need. She comes to VoteBeat from the Philadelphia Inquirer, where she worked as audience editor for enterprise and innovation. And Lauren will introduce the rest of our panel momentarily. Lauren, over to you. Thank you.
Cool, thanks. I'm really excited to be here. And I'm really excited to introduce everybody else because I'm really excited to talk to these people. So first up, Derek Kane. He's the director of community engagement at Resolve Philly in Philadelphia. He's a Philadelphia native and is passionate about shifting the news paradigm, connecting with people to ensure accurate and authentic storytelling. Most recently, he was a 2019 Reentry Think Media Justice Fellow, where he created and told stories about returning citizens that challenge stereotypes and illuminates hurdles to reentry. Next is Maria Mendez, service and engagement reporter at the Texas Tribune, focused on connecting with Texans to help them navigate politics and public policy and find the resources they need. Before that, she worked on public education at the Austin American-Statesman, border and business issues at Texas Public Radio, and politics and breaking news at the Dallas Morning News. And then Anna Yu is the director of Politico's director of engagement, oversees a team and manages engagement strategy, social storytelling, off-platform distribution and partnerships, and other experimental opportunities to reach new audiences and build deeper connections with readers. Before that, she was engagement editor at the Los Angeles Times, focused on social storytelling and enterprise projects. So everybody's done amazing work. And before we get into discussing community engagement specifically, let's talk about what is that? How do we think about that? Anybody would like to jump in? What do you think about community engagement? How do you approach it?
I can start. Thank you for having me. Well, at Resolve, we think, we believe that our community engagement team and how we build and structure all of our workflow is through the engagement team. And what we believe in is that building relationships that enables communities to participate in, understanding of, or multiple points of journalism process in order to achieve more trustworthy and accurate impactful storytelling. So how do we do that? We do that through engagement, and how we do that also is through the whole process of, from the beginning of a story, engagement should be thought of in the beginning, not just an afterthought. And also how we do that is through navigating complex relationships between community members and journalists. So that way they are able to understand one another and also to come together and to produce trustworthy and accurate, impactful storytelling.
Echo what Derek said. I think one thing I want to emphasize again is just the way you need to be open-minded and be starting on this early enough so that you're allowing what you're hearing from the community to actually shape your reporting, and it's not just like plug and play for good quotes or good anecdotes to fill in what you think the narrative is already going to be. So I think that open-mindedness is really key. I think another part of just like community engagement is also like a key thing we do before launching any project is just working on identifying reporting gaps. We have a senior engagement editor on my team who I hired specifically to focus on crowdsourcing, and that's kind of how she starts every conversation with the reporters. Like, what do you not know? What can not be seen or learned through data and through FOIAs?
Yeah, I think community engagement really comes down to like collaborating with communities in order to better serve them and improve your journalism. So yeah, it's not just highlighting them in a story or quoting them in a story. It's, asking them what information needs they have and how they can best digest information. Sometimes we write, very long narrative pieces that may not actually be serving people if they need something really quick and fast to get the resources they need. So yeah, I think it's just using input from the community to create journalism that is for them and not just about them.
Yeah, so like listening is definitely a theme here, for sure. So I guess, Maria, since you're like an active reporter right now, I'm really curious how you think about service journalism, how you approach this job differently than you might have other reporting jobs.
Yeah, so to me, service journalism is basically putting resources and actionable information front and center for readers. So I've done that a lot through things like resource guides and voter guides. And within that work, I try to focus on helping people not just understand the news, but how they can participate or get the help they need. So, for example, in our voter guides last year, we asked people what type of information they needed, what information they wanted to learn about elections. And one thing that a lot of people asked about was like very specific voting requirements or rules and regulations. So we expanded our voter guide to include a lot of those questions and include a lot of answers to those questions. And then did a lot more stories on just how elections work because people are really curious about that process as well. So yeah, and I think you have some of the, I think you have some of this information in traditional news stories. Like I've always tried to include resources and explain things in simple terms for people. But I think service journalism is different in that it really is emphasizing resources and actionable information instead of just including a line or paragraph in a story.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I personally always think about how people might access that information, so making it scannable, easy to find is good. Did anybody else have thoughts on like service journalism specifically? Cool. Listening is great. Annie, I think you were going to say something.
I was actually, this is like not helpful because I was like, well, not really, because you know, Politico is like a national publication and our focus isn't really like news you can use. It really is about the politics and policy. So I think that's just an interesting kind of difference there.
Yeah, that's actually a really good. Let's go to you, Annie, and talk about like trying to do this kind of work on a national level is a big challenge. So how do you approach that? What is like your guiding force there?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's super different. I think a lot of the, not traditional, but a lot of the ways I've seen, you know, audience engagement, community engagement journalists operate at a local level is just kind of thrown out the window for us. It's like, well, we can't do that because I can't set up and ask a reporter booth at the local fair. You know, I can't put up flyers or convene listening sessions at the library. Like, it's just when our audience is just so broad and what we cover is so broad, it's a little bit different. You know, I think for us, this is unique to Politico too, not specifically for like all national newsrooms, but sometimes there's a difference between who we're reporting on and who we hope will read the story. So I think that's just a key thing I start with. Sometimes we focus on one, sometimes we focus on the other. I think, you know, it's kind of project by project. So do you want me to go into examples, or I've kind of forgotten what your original question was?
It's just how you approach community engagement nationally. So
yeah,
totally.
Have an
example.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the people we're reporting on, like I think we had a really good example this week. Actually, we published earlier this week a story about marijuana and about just the disparate policy state by state and the lack of a federal policy. And that story, right, is about who it's about is people who depend on medical marijuana for obviously medical reasons, but who it's for is totally different, right? We're writing that story to put in front of lawmakers, basically in front of Congress members, to help them understand how this like disparate lack of federal policy is affecting real Americans on the ground. So for that, we focused on the first group for our crowdsourcing. You know, our senior engagement editor focused on like trying to help our reporter find these people on the ground all over the country. We actually like re-upped this years old marijuana call out that we had sent out like maybe 4 years ago or so. It was many years old, but we had like hundreds of responses for that call out, and we kind of re-upped that in addition to trying to find new people. And our lead anecdote was an incredible, compelling story about this mom and her teenage son who depend on medical marijuana. And that was how we found her. So it's kind of like this years long, I wouldn't say relationship because we didn't really like follow up with her in between those years, but it is something that like from years ago, we set the stage of like being able to kind of interview her. Our reporter spent an hour on the phone with her and then flew out to meet her. And then through her met all the other people in the story because of her community. And part of that, I think one lesson learned there that we've seen over and over is like, you know, you can't just as a national pub, like people hate it when you parachute in and are like, we want to talk about you. And then we like leave. So part of that is being able to gain, if you're able to gain the trust of someone who's in their community, that's how the rest of their community will also trust you. It's not by like trying to do like a blind call out to everyone, like we're this mythical organization and we want to talk to you, but it's like, no, we have gained the trust of this person and she is now telling all of her other people in the community that they should trust our reporting.
Yeah, like community relationships are really important for exactly what you said. I love that example of that. And
yeah,
yeah,
we think a lot about like, who do they trust? And how do we kind of, what can we learn from that? And how can we partner with them rather than just always, again, like parachuting in. So.
Yeah. Another thing is working with people instead of just asking them in an interview. Derek, you work most locally in one city versus like statewide or nationally. What is like your approach? What are some cool projects you've worked on with Resolve? How's that?
Well, part of our approach is, well, again, because I'm born and raised in the city of Philadelphia, it's kind of like I have an edge because, you know, again, I'm born and raised there. So I know the communities. I may not know them intimately, but I know of them from growing up around or adjacent to some of these neighborhoods. And as you always say in the city of Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. So definitely know a lot about that. So coming into the director's job at Director of Engagement at Resolve, I already had an idea of what was already being talked about, being needed in the community and what they wanted to see from the journalism side. So coming into that and having that understanding already was really a edge on me, for me to be able to build and continue to build relationships and in those communities. So that's how I kind of got started and how I'm able to build the relationships that I have, because some of them are existing and others, to your point that you were just saying, from other folks working with me saying, hey, Derek and Resolve, they're really good. You should want to talk to them and do things with them because they already built trust already with the person that they're talking to now. And a lot of times they just do that. And then they also refer you to other folks as well. So that's how we start. It's just really on the ground, being in the communities. Oftentimes at Resolve, I'll show up at a block party and just hang out and just talk with folks, you know, stuff like that. We've done things where we went to libraries. We have a series called Sound Offs. Sound offs are small group conversations, usually between 5 to 25 people. We keep them small and intimate because we find our experience that the smaller the group, the more people want to engage, you know, more of the bigger panelist type setups. A lot of folks are feeling intimidated oftentimes, so they don't really speak up in those environments. So we keep them small and we do them around the city. We meet the communities where they're at most of the time, whether it's in a library, rec center, like I said, at a block party, we're there, you know, so it's doing that and also partnering with or collaborating with community organizations, because oftentimes those community organizations have the trust of the community. So they definitely going to listen to them or work with them because they're already built trust in that community. And oftentimes we collaborate with them when we're doing whatever it's a sound off or just going out to build relationships. So that's how we start our engagement, and that's how we continue throughout the process of the journalism. Reporting is building relationships, collaborating with community partners is probably the strongest way to start engagement.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about trust now, and I feel like that's like a big buzzword recently, but like, how would you think about building actual trust? What does that mean? How do you know if you have it, basically? Does anyone have thoughts there?
Go ahead, Derek. Oh,
Go ahead, Andy. I can talk all day. Go ahead.
oh my gosh. I think when it comes to trust, like transparency is really helpful. And also just knowing that like people respond to humans. I think especially at Politico, it's like politics is a pretty toxic topic and dividing topic. So it can get pretty like nasty, right? In the comments, for example, on social. And, just the number of times we've seen like a simple like response from one of us as a human, like, hey, we actually did report on that thing you're complaining about, or, here it is, they just do this 180 and they're like, oh my gosh, thanks so much. I love your reporting. Like it's kind of, that happens all the time, or that's not the only example, but, things like, why didn't you report on this angle? Or like, why are you even covering Trump anymore? Right? Like just a simple response as a respectful human, I think does a lot in terms of like how people view our newsroom. And I'm talking about social specifically, but like other people are able to see that in the comments. Like, I think that's really helpful. So that's one aspect.
Yeah, Derek, if you had something to add to that.
It's a lot to that. So I'm trying to think of it in a way where, when you're talking about building relationships and working in communities, it starts also with the messenger oftentimes, and I know, especially in Black communities, it's been a long time where often there's reporting that's not accurate, reporting that's flat out wrong. So there's a mistrust that's been going on a long time. So going into the community, and before we even talk about journalism, it is being that, you are a human. And I like to approach folks the way I would want to be approached and what makes sense to me. So oftentimes that's how my approach is. And then I'm being very transparent of who I am and why I'm there. And I think starting off that way helps peel back some of the mistrust, because now they know who you are and why you're there. You're not coming in, and again, you're not swooping in and trying to just get any type of information and leave. You're just saying, hey, I'm here to build to talk to you guys, to build relationships, but also I am a journalist, or I work in the journalism field. This is what I'm doing. And I think if you break that down in a way where a person feels comfortable, regardless if they may not agree with or may have mistrust with journalists, the way you approach them may change that. So I think that's the most important thing as the messenger. How do you approach the communities?
Yeah.
I think to book into that, like Derek's talking about how you approach them, I think another key aspect is the end. Like you need to come back to the people you talked to and that you asked for help from, and show them what you did with the reporting, even if their like quote or story isn't included. We do this a lot with most of our crowdsourcing projects, and this is like one of the biggest areas where we see like thankful comments, like people are thanking us and saying, I appreciate you showing this. And like, even though my story's not in there, I appreciate seeing what you did with this, because then it really shows them like we were listening and we didn't just kind of like, grab your quote and run with it and forget about you. So.
Yeah, I love having the actual example. Go ahead, Maria.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think part of it, kind of like y'all have touched on, is just like engaging in media or news literacy. So, for example, obviously explaining how the process of, for me as a reporter, how I'm going to go and interview somebody, how their information is going to be used. But I think even going beyond some of those basics, and for example, after you've written a draft, calling up the source and fact checking things and making sure that you understood what they were trying to say, because sometimes there are misunderstandings, and it's better to clear that up before you publish. And I think also just having conversations with people who may, be having problems, and sometimes they may not understand the full context of that, and therefore might be, putting misleading information online or things like that is also helpful. I had to do that a while ago during elections. There were some rumors of quote unquote vote switching on voting machines here in Texas. And I ended up talking to somebody who had posted about that online, and they explained that they just had a really hard time with the voting machine, and they were concerned, and from a good place wanted to warn other people to double check before like finalizing their votes. And she, at the end of the story and the conversation, she thanked us because we actually took the time to talk to her, include her perspective in the story, instead of just dismissing her post or her concerns as, completely wrong or invalid. So I think it's a lot of conversations and being frank and honest with members of the public.
Maria, you're reminding me of like another content angle as well, or I call it the preemptive fact check, where it's like, especially before an election, you kind of anticipate where are the areas of misinformation and where are the areas that people are going to distrust or be like, that's fake news. And how can you kind of preemptively warn people, not warn, like prepare them, right? It's as simple as like, okay, we should have a story, that publishes 2 days before the election day that says, hey, here's how long we expect ballot counting to take, right? And like, it's totally normal. And like, here's how it's been happened for every election in the last X amount of years. So that's just one example, but I think that's pretty key too, especially when it comes to like political misinformation.
For sure.
Yeah, I talk about that all the time. Sorry. I just wanted to post this. I have this bookmarked because it's so good. First Draft wrote a guide to pre-bunking, they call it. And that's exactly what you were just describing, Annie.
Oh, I love that. Maybe that's a better name. Pre-bunking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like a preemptive fact check.
Right. And it's based on like real human psychological principles. But yeah, Derek, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I just wanted to add to what Maria's saying and highlight what she was saying as far as when she walks through her process. I think that's so important. Oftentimes we'll have workshops, and our community engagement team will have workshops, and journalists will say, well, what could we do right now? What could we walk away with right now? And I think that right there is a form of engagement in itself, just explaining your process, because you're leveling the expectations so they now know what to expect moving forward. And I think that's a form of engagement, but I think that's just a great way to build relationships as well.
Yeah, a lot of people are really nervous and have never spoken to a journalist in their lives and don't know how that's going to work or what's going to happen. And what I was going to say before is like, people may not fully trust you until they see the actual story posted, because then they know like, oh, you actually did the thing. That's kind of what Annie was saying earlier, but yeah, level setting is always great. Awesome. Okay, sorry. There was a really interesting question that was submitted that I wanted to get to. This is from Latrell. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that not correctly, but basically a lot of newsrooms and journalists talk about engagement work and claim to do engagement work. Is there like things you wish you had done better in the past, or like what industry-wide kind of like thoughts on engagement might not be a good idea in practice?
What was that last part? What might not be a good?
Yeah, so like general like industry wisdom, what's like not great to do with this? I think we already kind of touched on some of this, just like parachuting's not great. Yeah.
I could add something. I feel oftentimes I've seen this happen before with a news organization in Philly where they wanted to have an engagement event with a community. It was a Nicetown community in Philadelphia. And it was around police shooting, and they wanted to have conversations with the journalists as well as the neighbors to talk about that event that happened in that neighborhood. And they had the event somewhere else, and a lot of the people couldn't even make it because it wasn't even in their community. So I think stuff like that is, if you really want to engage with the community, especially in an event that happened in their neighborhood, and you're having it where they can't get to it somewhere else, I don't think that's great. So I think that should be a practice that shouldn't happen, especially when you're talking about communities and being in where they're at, meeting them where they're at.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, some reporters were like, I'm going to crowdsource. They like tweet about it and they're like, can you retweet it? And it's like, well, you're trying to reach, for example, farmers in this state. Like they're not going to see your Twitter feed. Like where you have to kind of start where, again, what Derek said, meet them where they are, whether that's physically or if you think about how they consume media, how they get news and information. I think that's a really critical piece before you just start being like, I'm going to do crowdsourcing or I'm going to launch a call out.
Yeah, I think people often get excited about call outs or like those crowdsourcing requests for sources, but I think you also have to think about like whether that's going to end up being more extractive or like taking more than rather giving in the whole process. For example, we have a texting line where we regularly share information about the election when that was happening, and now about Texas's legislative session. And we ask people like, what information do you need, or what questions or thoughts do you have? But we're careful to not just like bombard people with like, we're working on a story about marijuana, tell us what you want or what you need about this, because we realize that just, you know, is bombarding people's phones. They're not going to want to engage, you know, and so we really focus on like providing resources and the most critical information out there. So I think you have to be selective when it comes to engagement. Sometimes you can't expect it to work for every single thing.
I also think this is more of like a structural newsroom thing, or for higher level managers. But, you know, if you're thinking about like expanding or starting an engagement team, like there are some newsrooms, I apologize if this is one of y'all's, you know, some newsrooms kind of structure it as like this, these are the engagement reporters and these are the people who do that and are the pros. And like, I think that's really great. And I think, Maria, maybe your title is engagement reporter, and I think that's amazing. I think one caveat though that you should keep in mind is that like, I don't think it's great if like those three people are the only reporters who ever think about audience engagement and crowdsourcing, because that's their job. And like everyone else can do like, not think about it. I think that's the danger in setting up the structure like that. So I would just kind of caution, not against it, but like, just think about it. And how are you going to spread the message around and kind of open up training and access for the rest of the newsroom to be able to use these kinds of strategies, not just like those three.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the reasons I was really excited about VoteBeat is the culture is definitely like everybody does engagement, and I'm just here as like the full-time expert to help people do that. So it's really awesome that we get to do that here. And I love seeing all kinds of engagement reporters in roles that are continuing to pop up. Given that there's like a lot of terms in the industry of like community engagement versus audience engagement. Is there a difference between those two?
It depends on your newsroom, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In some places, engagement editor equals social media manager. It's really just what it is. In other places, engagement editor has nothing to do with social and it's all about like crowdsourcing or something. So it just depends where you are.
I think, yeah, I think it really depends on the space where you're at, but I think at the Texas Tribune, we do think about the two a little bit differently. I think we think about audience engagement a little bit more broadly, of like engaging with like our existing readers, and community engagement more as like finding those communities that we are failing to serve right now and aren't necessarily engaging with, but that we want to make the intention an effort to find and engage with, even if that doesn't necessarily help our metrics or whatever, you know. So I think there can be a distinction.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a difference. Maria basically said exactly what I was going to say. I look at, well, at Resolve, we look at audience as, you know, like social, like who you're talking to, more of an audience, versus community, who is where who you're talking, they're talking to you and you're talking with them. It's more, you know, it's more deep, it's more intentional, it's more listening, it's more that when you're thinking about community engagement, where audience, you're just talking about, you know, just kind of getting your word out, just speaking, more like a panel kind of discussion. That's how we look at audience engagement.
Yeah, and it depends on the newsroom, definitely. I agree with Annie. And sometimes I feel like it's that audience engagement started first gaining steam, and then it's kind of evolved into, oh, we actually need to do community engagement. So I feel like sometimes it's just like similar thing, but less focused on just the internet. But yeah, we are talking a lot about trust and building relationships with readers and all of those things. How do you think that might help fight misinformation or help inform people?
I think, like I touched on this before, I think if you build a relationship with people, you can find out what questions or concerns they're hearing or they personally have, and then learn about what type of information they're already getting and whether it may be factual or not. And then you can provide them with the tools, whether that's like news literacy of learning how to find verifiable sources of information, or actual news stories and content that helps them understand and provides context to different topics. I think if you do that, then you're better serving them, instead of just assuming, oh, you know, this is popping off on Twitter, therefore people must be thinking about this, or this is the latest news, you know, this is what people care about. Because sometimes there's a really big disconnect, especially with communities of color.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, basically the same thing. Yeah, that's the best way of doing it.
Yeah, and that was like a really big question, but that was the best way to answer it, I think. Yeah, so we're talking to different communities and what they need. Part of that is accessibility, which can be many different things, and difficult to determine. Like, it could just be, let's translate this, or whether or not a paywall is needed or anything like that. Does anybody have thoughts on how they would approach that or think about that?
Yeah, I think that's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently. Is, you know, we have been creating more of these resource guides, and trying to place this information in front of readers. And we're a nonprofit newsroom, and so all our information is, you know, free for people to view, and people can also republish it. But we've been talking a lot more about like accessibility in terms of, like, for example, when there's a really big freeze in Texas or a natural disaster, like, is our website actually helpful to people if they have limited cell phone service? Or, you know, is our website actually accessible to people with disabilities who may need simpler plain language, or, you know, have different needs? And we've also heard from some of our readers in our surveys and call outs that they learn better through video or multimedia content. And so we've also been thinking about, like, okay, maybe we need to, instead of just writing really long explainers, simplify them or write them in different formats and maybe create videos along with them. So yeah, I think once you start learning about the needs of your community, you realize that people learn and take information in a lot of different ways. So, you know, the sky's kind of the limit to like innovating and being creative in how to present that information.
Yeah, that's tough for us. The same thing. We're just kind of thinking of different mediums to try to get to reach everyone as much as possible. Like, for instance, we have a text line because we have a huge digital divide in the city of Philadelphia. So everyone doesn't have internet access. So we use the text line. We also have a physical newsletter that we put out. So oftentimes we'll send them to rec centers, libraries, wherever, you know, in order to get that out there to try to, you know, help with mitigate some of that, those barriers. So it's just, to Marie's point, like, just trying to figure out, like, what is, when you put the stuff out there and you get the feedback from your community, hey, is this helpful? And if not, what's a better way we could have done it, you know, and try to take that in consideration when we're doing the next newsletter or wherever we're doing project that we're doing. So it's, like you said, it's kind of like not one answer. It's just kind of like trying it whatever you can in the means of your organization to try to get it out.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, even just like for people who have internet access. Everybody accesses news across varying different platforms. So it's just very interesting to try to be everywhere at once sometimes. But that's how you get to talk to people and reach out to them. But yeah, I feel like, me personally, journalists talking about building trust is a more recent phenomenon, but like, how do we think that may have evolved over time? And where do we think this is gonna go in the future? Or where would we like it to go?
I would love to see more community centered, like communities themselves producing news and working in their own community, because they're the most experienced in their community. They have them oftentimes, like in the city of Philadelphia, again, because we're a city of neighborhoods, oftentimes there's some solutions or to a problem in one section of the city, and they may not know they could do that same thing in the other side. So having that way of kind of interconnecting all these different communities and having this kind of like community newswire situation happen, where oftentimes that, you know, you're cycling these news or these news reports, but with solutions and how they can be used in different areas of the city. So I think in the future, I'd love to see that. We're working on that to try to work with communities to elevate these narratives and have them tell their stories, but also come up with some solution-oriented pieces too, to help mitigate some of the many issues in the city of Philadelphia. And as far as journalists building trust and how that looks in the future, I think I know now, and I've been doing this now since 2019. From 2019 to now, I've heard more journalists talk about implementing that in their process than I've ever heard in 2019 when I first started. So I can just see the shift is changing, because they see that building those relationships is not just it's going to be able to get reporting done or have more stories come out, but it's actually building relationships and helping folks. So, and I think at the end of the day, everybody wants to do that and want to be feeling good about the work that they do. So I feel like people are going to take that more into consideration when they're doing their work.
I feel like it'll become even more like individual reporter focused, rather than a publication. Obviously, as people trust newsrooms less, like we need to make I think people are understanding more the need to like earn the trust and not just assume that people will just continue to read our work and trust it. But I think even as I think about like, you know, when you talk about who does good COVID reporting, right? People are like, wow, Ed Yong from The Atlantic has done great work over the pandemic. People use that name. They don't say The Atlantic has done great work. Like, sure, he's attached to The Atlantic, but wherever if he leaves today, right, and goes somewhere else, they'll follow him and be like, that's where the good COVID reporting is, not at The Atlantic. So like, that's kind of a problem in some sense to like newsrooms and brands like that. But I think, I don't know, could also be an opportunity.
I think I would like to see more of like pulling back the curtain on journalism and how we do reporting and empowering communities to maybe do it themselves, especially like, for example, our trouble at the Texas Tribune is we're a statewide publication, and it's not as hard as being a national publication, but we still can't serve every single county in Texas. And sometimes we get questions that are very specific to one county, and we just don't have the resources to look into that. Or like people will ask us about different bills and we can't follow every single bill. There's thousands of them. And so I would love for us and for other publications to do more work of like, this is how you follow a bill. This is, you know, how you do open records for your local government or state government, you know, so people can still get the information they need, even if, you know, every newsroom can't necessarily provide it.
I love that. And I feel like I've seen some call outs that kind of combine that, right? Where it's like, here's how you request your attendance score, and then please share it with us so we can see it. Like it's very educational, which is good.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I really like that idea too. And also like what Derek was talking about communities producing their own journalism or news, because like most of the time it's reporters filing FOIAs, but everyone can do it. That's literally how that works. It's available to the public. So I love the idea of informing people how to access that kind of thing. And we're talking a lot about like resources, needing to do more things. Partnerships is one way to do that better. We actually had a question about this from Chelsea. Do you have any recommendations for choosing or approaching community partners for an engagement project? And what are some tips for successful partnerships and having a relationship there?
Yeah. Building relationships with community partners it's a good thing. I talk about it all the time, and we do it a lot. But oftentimes, you want to make sure that you're partnering with the right or the most credible or the most trusted organization in the community. And oftentimes it's not just at face value. You know, they may come to you and say they're doing all these great things in this community, and they may be there for years. But when you go to the ground and you actually talk to the community members, oftentimes they'll say, no, we really don't mess with them like that. So being aware of the community, that they're the community partner, and seeing what they're doing, but also going into the community and talking to the residents to see if they're doing and if they're credible, if they're trustworthy, in order to partner with them. I think that's the key when you're thinking about partnering with any community organization, where you're at, just making sure that what they're doing is authentic and the communities really do trust them.
I think one thing that I've learned from like trying to build relationships, and when we do call outs, I try to share it with different interest groups or community groups that, you know, are already bringing people together that care about politics and policy, and therefore could get the word out. One thing that I've learned from that is, like, even if they don't interact with you or respond the first time, maybe like the third time they'll respond and actually share the call out, or like be more eager to talk to you. So I think, like, even if it doesn't work out the first time, it can be helpful to try multiple times. And I also wouldn't necessarily just stop at, you know, organizations or groups that are already friendly with your newsroom, because sometimes you're surprised, and, you know, maybe a more conservative or different leaning group might actually be interested in sharing that call out or resource as well.
This might be a slight tangent, but what Derek was saying reminded me about how, like, we test every like major call out that we launch. We user test it with a small group of people who are in that community and get their feedback on it. And that has been invaluable, because sometimes, right, they're like, well, as a member of this community, the way you worded this is so off-putting, or like, you know, the time that you're requiring, how could I possibly do that? You know, they just have really valuable feedback for you. And I think that really helps with like eventually gaining their trust when you do, like, you know, you're listening to them, you're making your call out better. And that's just like a win-win. And then therefore that person in that community can then kind of share it in good faith and be like, I trust that they were listening to me throughout this process. They created this for us, and now I'm going to share it with my community. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but reminded me about that.
And oftentimes too, and to kind of tie all that in with when we're doing our community partners, events with community partners, oftentimes it's not actually, like you said, organization. It's been times where it's been a block habit, or it's just been somebody on the block that's been there for a long time and just knows everyone, and, you know, and they're very connected in that community and very trusted. So oftentimes it's that, but you don't find that out until you're in the community.
Yeah, you got to go.
Yeah, I love that, because I feel like journalists often just like think about engagement as like finding more sources, but they can be like editors too and partners in a specific way. So I think that's a really cool example. I have another question, but I just wanted to see if I can clarify it, but none of us deal with like opinion pieces in our newsrooms anyway. So this question is, can you explain how your newsroom's editorial work, like overall work, influences community engagement strategy? And then I'll add, like, how does your mission affect your decisions with that?
Sorry, how does the overall work?
Like, yeah, the overall
newsroom
work. Or like what you're focusing on, I suppose, and what yeah.
I mean, obviously, we follow what our newsroom priorities are, right? Sorry if I'm misunderstanding, but like, right, like if our priorities are, we want to reach this kind of reader on the Hill, or, you know, we're focused on this kind of topic, like it doesn't matter how like cool it would be to launch a call out about XYZ. Like, if that's not what our reporters would report on and what we would prioritize, we're not going to do it. I think I thought about this like 2 days ago about something. I forget what. I'm like, oh, that would be cool for a call out, but we're not going to do it because that's not what Politico reports on and prioritizes. So I don't know if that was the question. But.
Yeah, I think that is an answer. Yeah, that works. But yeah, so go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, like the Texas Tribune focuses on politics and public policy, and we have been thinking about what that actually means to everyday people. So we are trying to think about it differently, but our focus is a lot of like civic engagement when it comes to like our engagement and audience work. But yeah, sometimes we've also been thinking like about how our readers or Texans respond to getting a lot of negative news. So we've also been trying to think about more creative ways to also talk about civic engagement. So for example, I wrote a story a while ago that was like, here are 5 times that people advocated at the Capitol, and it worked, because I think oftentimes people hear more about efforts or bills failing to pass, and that's what happens more commonly. But we've also been thinking about like how to give people hope and joy even as they're consuming politics and public policy.
That's a really good point. I've thought about something similar. It sounds really negative to be like, not for the goal of giving people hope, but like the goal, it was just based off an observation that like, because there's still time to do something about something, right? Like protest, whatever, get out the vote against or for someone, because of that hopeful time, like people are just much more interested in sharing that kind of content and telling their friends, right? It's like, it's kind of like their reason is activism. That's not the reason we wrote about it, but, you know, for example, so I think about that a lot, like in terms of like, some people are like, oh, should we post about it before or after? And a lot of times I'm like, before. That's when people are first hearing about it. That's when they're more motivated to be like, my friends should know about this, or I should tell people to do something about this.
Yeah, Derek, did you have anything you wanted to?
Yeah, I wanted you to kind of clarify the question again, so I understand, have a little more clarity.
Yeah. I'm also a little unclear on the question, but let's do, how does your mission influence how you approach engagement?
Okay, so what, with reference to like a op-ed piece or something, like a community member wants to read, that's what you're talking about, like an opinion piece, op-ed piece, how do you approach it, right? Well, during how we do it here, we elevate that. We would love to talk to community members that want to talk more about or have opinions about what's going on in their communities. For example, it was a gentleman who was trying to get with one of the legacy newsrooms in Philly, and wanted to write an op-ed about gun violence, because at the time, you know, gun violence was still out of control, but at that time it was like record numbers. And he had a solution, and he felt, because he's doing it in his community, and he just couldn't get anyone to respond to it. So he reached out to us, and we worked with him. He had it written already pretty much, and there's nothing really we had to do. So we went over it, make sure it was cool, whatever. And then we were able to bridge that gap between the two, and got the legacy newsrooms organization to print the actual piece. And the piece, again, you know, yes, it was an opinion piece. It's what he wrote it. It was an op-ed, but at the same time, it was a solution that he felt or is doing in his community around gun violence, and could help others as well. So stuff like that, we definitely promote. We want to highlight, and we want to work with community members to do that. So that's kind of our mission, is working with community members to get these words out. So that's how we approach it.
You know, it's really cool too, talking about like civically engaged. I mean, writing an opinion piece for a newspaper, I think qualifies, I say, as someone who's a journalist. So I think that's a really cool way to help people. There's like a fine line between like an opinion piece and a profile. It's just very interesting sometimes, or like a first person, like Chalkbeat does a lot of those. So sometimes it's a little bit gray, I'll say. Anyway, I'm trying to think about trust again. I'm at the end of my questions, so I'm just coming up with a summary, because like basically we talked a lot about like building relationships with readers, which is like a fairly more recent phenomenon to be talking about more often in news. And that's what makes me excited to do my job a lot of times. Like, hey, someone had this question about, like during the midterm, someone had a question, hey, I'm not sure how to apply for an absentee ballot. I'm overseas. So I was like, okay, I know exactly where on this website to find that for you. Because sometimes the government websites are just old and difficult to navigate. So that's another example of giving resources to people. Yeah.
Yeah, I
If-
wanted to say, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, I think that's like a perfect example of service journalism. And I spent a lot of time also doing some of that question answering during the elections. But yeah, sometimes it's not even like writing a story or writing content. It's just like answering those questions that you get from readers.
I will also point out, I think I mentioned earlier, how like Politico doesn't really do as much of that kind of practical service journalism stuff, but we have used it before. Like, you know, obviously my team handles social, and, you know, there's kind of a more general audience there than there are on within the number of people who come to our site. But we have used like news you can use angles to try to connect people and get them to understand and care more about the wonkier like policy stories that we have. So for example, when inflation was really getting crazy a couple years ago now, but still, we did this like custom chart on social that was like, if you made this much in 2018 or whatever, like here's how much you'd have to make now to like basically make the same amount of money, to just show that's kind of news you can use the angle in. And then we use that to be like, to point to a story about like the strategy behind the Fed's raising of the interest rates, right? So that's like a really wonky policy story, but we're like, we understand that like the news you can use part of that is kind of what appeals to like a large number of people and helps them understand like the basic setup of like what you need to know before you kind of dive into this policy piece.
Yeah, we have through our text line, we have where you're able to text in a question, you know, and it started during the pandemic. And at the time when we first started, it would be, you know, if someone wanted to know where they can get tested at in their community, you know, and we would send, you know, text out where in that community, what zip code do you live in, and say, here's these different places you can get tested, or you can get text from these places. So that's what we try to use our text line for, because oftentimes we can't be in everyone's community. So the text line is probably one of our lighter lift for us to be able to reach community members. We got quite a few questions in about just needing information on stuff. And also too, questions where it's like, sometimes I know in Philadelphia, we have a whole lot of information, and sometimes it's hard for community members to decipher through all of that. So oftentimes they'll say, I went on the website, I don't understand, how do I do X, Y, and Z? And then we give more, you know, easier access, but quicker answers to help them navigate that. So I think that's also a part of this, you know, we talk about service journalism. I think that helps as well, being to simplify some of the things that, or to take less information from some of the stuff that's so vast of information, different stuff they have out there.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's like the core of what journalism is trying to make the world make sense. And I love that we can do it like in very specific ways like that. And I feel like what happens a lot of times is journalists are reporting on things like inflation because it affects real people, but then we like don't think about explicitly saying like, hey, this is how it affects you and what you can do about it. And that's why I like solutions journalism a lot. In service journalism, it just gets right to like, you don't have to overthink this complicated, wonky article. Here's what you can actually do. So if you had any thoughts on that. Okay. All right. Is there anything you guys wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about?
I have a whole lot, but I don't think we have enough time.
I want to hear what Derek has to say, but yeah,
go
I know
ahead.
we
have a few more minutes if you want to talk about something.
Derek, tell us something you're working on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple initiatives, and our latest initiative is called Shake the Table, and we're actually we have a mayoral race coming up. So what we have 10 candidates right now that's running for mayor. So in our Shake the Table, is what we want to do is we wanted to focus on city systems. We oftentimes hear when mayors come into our communities, we're talking about the bigger major topics, which are of course a problem in the city, but we never hear about the mayors coming into the community saying, how do I make the city of Philadelphia work better for you? And we want to focus on that. How do you do that? How do we make the city systems, the streets department, the trash department, how do we make them be more efficient in when you're calling in for an issue in your community? So we're focusing on that, and also holding these mayoral candidates accountable for the things that they're saying during their race. So we be able to come back. We're putting together a tool yet, but that's TBD, on where they're able to go and see what the mayor has to say, whatever platform he ran on, and did he do it, or is he doing it? Is he actually doing what he said he wanted to do to get your vote? And we're also doing some civic engagement, working in communities to work with community members to ask questions specifically to get the answer from a candidate. So that came up in one of our sound offs. The sound off, like I said, it's small group conversations. And during that time, the community member was saying, well, when we ask the mayor or the candidate a question, we feel like we're getting a runaround. So what came out of that, the theme from them, it was in that community, was trying to get the mayoral candidate to answer the question, not just do the candidates thing, just spin people. So we actually had another feedback, which we call a sound off feedback session or info session, where we went back and had actual questions and answers workshop, where we brought in some journalists and we did some examples of how to ask a question to get the answer that you want, and how not to ask the question, so that way you don't, so to distinguish between the two. And we workshopped that with them, so they walked out of that feeling really good. So the next panel discussion that they have, they'll be able to go and feel more equipped to ask the question to get the right answer. So that's just some of the stuff that we're working on. That's our newest initiative called Shake the Table.
That sounds really cool. Again, I love giving people tools and availability to be more civically engaged. I live in Philly, so I've been thinking about these SEPTA bus discussions, and I wish we could tell people that it was happening before it happened more often. But yeah, that's a great example. Is anybody else working on something they would like to talk about?
Sure. I think one of the projects my team is working on, it's this initiative called the Politico Mayors Club. It's this yearly thing where we've tried to poll and interview a lot of mayors across the country in previous years about just kind of what is happening on the ground that state and federal leaders should know about, and what is really happening in their cities. But it was really difficult to kind of get a ton of mayors to participate. And I think one of the things we came up with was let's turn it into an exclusive club, first of all, that is more structured. We have exactly one mayor from all 50 states participating, who we selected among a variety of factors. So we are 50 mayors participating in the Politico Mayors Club. And they've all agreed preemptively to be we'll do one quarterly survey that we respond to you immediately about whatever topic it is that quarter. So I think the first one we did, it might have been crime or housing, I forget. But we already did the first survey, and the story should come out pretty soon. But it's pretty exciting because it's this is a group of people, they're both readers and the people we're writing about, It's kind of the rare intersection where that's happening. And how do we get them really engaged and excited by Politico and our reporting, and want to come back to us and want to talk to us regularly all year, 4 times a year. So the first survey already went out, and I think it was pretty good. And we're really excited about it. And we're also tapped 2 consultants to work with us as we formed the survey questions, the order, the worder, the wording, the topic, everything we ran by this professional survey person, because that's a thing you can have a PhD in. We're not professional survey makers. So we made sure to kind of run it by her and do some testing there first.
Those are all really cool projects. I think what we have been focusing on is Texas's legislative session, because that's the big news right now. But when it comes to engagement, I think this might be the first time we did a call out specifically asking people what do you want to know about the legislative session, or what would you tell lawmakers if you could, and different questions like that. We also tried asking people about any interesting experiences they had at the Capitol, since when we wrote some of those initial first stories about, what it's like to go advocate at the Capitol. We found some really interesting stories, and I think we want to find more opportunities to just showcase how people are engaged in politics so that other people can see themselves also doing that if they want. And yeah, I think we'll just be focused on sharing resources and helping people, follow the news as it finally picks up in Texas in April and May, which is when lawmakers rush to pass bills and it gets kind of chaotic. So I think that'll be a big moment for us to really help keep readers engaged and updated. But yeah.
Yeah, those all sound like really great efforts. That's awesome. I wanted to say one last parting thing. It's like building a relationship with people is more than just like sending call outs periodically. I love gathering people's opinions, but I also get really nervous when that's all people are doing, because you can get some really great ideas just from the people themselves. And you don't know what they're wondering about or worried about until you ask them. So I just wanted to say that from what Maria was talking about. And yeah, this was a great conversation. Hannah, I don't know if you want to wrap up or not.
All I have to say is thank you so much to especially to our panelists, including you, Lauren, as a moderator. Y'all just bring so much brilliance to the table here. So really, really appreciate your time. And thanks for everybody who's tuning in on Zoom and on Facebook. We appreciate your participation. And that's a wrap. Chad, I see you're back. So if you would like to say anything as well.
Just thank you. Thank you for a riveting conversation. This was great.
Yes, we learned so much.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Too.